We had just started looking at some of the parables that Jesus told in his ministry, and these parables illustrated an important lesson. And the lesson is that it really matters how you hear Jesus's teachings. Because there's a lot of forces at work that oppose our ability to hear Jesus properly. There are so many obstacles that we need to overcome. In fact, you could make the argument, it's actually really easy to miss the point of some of the things Jesus taught, and certainly it's easy to not follow through on his teachings with our application. Jesus makes the point, listen, if you want this thing to be real, you're going to have to engage with Jesus' words. You're going to have to hold on to what he says no matter what, no matter how you're being tested, and you need to put these words into action. If you want it to change your life, that's the way it's going to have to work. And I think that's an important message to chew on for the last 3 weeks or so. But now that we're back in Luke chapter 8, it looks like the teaching portion is done, at least for the moment. And Jesus is deciding to take his followers on a field trip. Take a look at verse 22 of Luke chapter 8, please. It says, one day he, that's Jesus, got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, let us go across to the other side of the lake. So they set out. And as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. And they went and they woke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. And he awoke, rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, where is your faith? And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, who then is this, that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him? Now, part of the problem with this passage is that there's probably several different sermons I could preach from here. There's at least two. The first one goes something like this. It's probably the most obvious one, and maybe you've heard a sermon like this from this passage. And what it does is it shines a bright spotlight on the central figure of this parable, who is Jesus, right? And the sermon would, if it did its job right, would call all of us to see and to appreciate Jesus' supernatural divine power over the forces of chaos in our lives. It would be a sermon about calling out to Jesus for help when you're in the middle of the storms of your life, and you get to watch him rebuke the wind and the waves and bring calm and peace into the craziest of situations. I mean, think about it. All he has to do is command, and the wind and the waters have to obey him? That's crazy. That is somebody that I want in my boat when trouble comes, right? That's a person who I can trust in the deepest of all the crises that I have to face. This is somebody who can more than just talk a good game. This person, Jesus, he can deliver. He is the Lord of the storm. So when I'm in trouble and when the storms hit me, all I got to do is find wherever he is, cry out to him, and then he'll step up and he'll take care of the rest. I don't know, that's kind of a decent sermon, right? I think that could work, right? Them dogs could hunt, as they say. I've heard a few sermons like that about this passage in my day, and they're good sermons, and I think they're appropriate. But there's another sermon here in this little paragraph. And this is one that doesn't draw our attention so much to Jesus, but to the disciples who were with him in the boat. Because what are they doing while Jesus is speaking calm to the storm? They are freaking out. They're cowering before the winds and the waves. They are convinced they're going to die. Now, I think Luke definitely wants us to see the triumphant, supernaturally powerful Jesus in this story. Obviously, Jesus is the central figure for a reason. But it's clear to me that Luke cares a lot about how the disciples are processing what they're going through. Luke believes that there are some lessons we need to learn from how the disciples respond to the storm, and also how they respond to Jesus' ability to calm the storm. Because think about it, who are going to be most of the readers of Luke's gospel? They're going to be people like you and me who aspire to be followers of Jesus. And I think Luke wants us to learn a few lessons through their example so that, you know what, maybe we don't have to learn everything the hard way. Wouldn't it be nice to learn a few things from the mistakes of others without you having to make all the mistakes yourself? So I think Luke wants us to look. And here's the funny thing. The good news is we don't just learn lessons from successes, do we? We also learn learn lessons from failure. And make no mistake, this little trip across the Galilee is a failure by the disciples. They were hit with, yes, an unexpected test, a test of their faith. A little surprise pop quiz, and we all know how much students love those. In the form, right, of this sudden storm. But they don't handle the test very well at all. So before we get into the details, let me just ask you a quick question. Have you ever experienced something like that? There's a sudden conflict that pops up in your life. And immediately you go from calm and peace and everything's going fine to now your well-being, your relationships, your finances, your health, something is completely up in the air. And it makes you wonder from one minute to the next, I was doing fine, but now am I even going to survive this? Now, of course, you know intellectually in your head, Jesus is in the boat with me. And you know what? That knowledge that he's in the boat with me is supposed to make a difference right now. It's supposed to fill me with confidence and peace in the storm. But I got news for you, it just doesn't. Because I'm looking around for Jesus and he doesn't seem to be doing anything. He's asleep in the boat somewhere. And I feel threatened, I feel abandoned, I feel alone to face the storm on my own. So what do? I freak out. I scramble to fix it myself, to get somebody else to fix it for me, or at least relieve the pain and the discomfort in all the wrong places. But then funny thing happens. The storm that you thought was going to knock you out completely calms. Your sanity is a little bit restored. And you realize in that moment that you just completely blew it. God fixed a situation you couldn't fix. And he did it in spite of you, not because of your faith, not because you trusted him, but simply because he knew, okay, I got to take pity on this guy, on this girl. God gave you a test, and you failed it. How do you enjoy the taste of failure in your mouth? I hate it. There is nothing that makes me more upset or anxious than failure or the prospect of failure. But here's what I think Luke is trying to say to people like me, to you. There are lessons to be learned here too. There are lessons you have to learn in the context of failure that you wouldn't learn any other way. And the master, the teacher, loves you too much to let you dodge those lessons for your whole life. So Luke is going to tell us a story about students who fail their teacher, about servants who let their master down, so that maybe you and I can figure out, how do we handle our failures when they come? How can we still grow and prosper and even maybe thrive in the context of having failed a test that he gave to us? Now, before we get back, and I keep saying before, you're getting nervous. It's okay. I only have so many pages here and they're going to get used up, I promise. But before we dive into the specifics here of the storm, I want to take a moment and I want to remind you of the incredible job that Jesus, the teacher, had done to try to prepare these disciples for this test before it came. Right? Because that's our complaint, students, isn't it? When the pop quiz comes up, hey, you didn't prepare me for this. And any teacher worth his or her salt should be very offended by that. Because their job in the intervening time is to make sure you're ready for that test, even if you're not ready for the test. And so Was Jesus preparing them? Did Jesus do a good job? I actually want to make the suggestion that he really did. He had prepared them with everything that they needed to pass this test with flying colors. Well, how? How in the world did Jesus help them? Okay, how had the disciples been prepared? Well, first of all, they had heard mind-blowing teaching. I mean, if you go back to Luke chapter 4, and we've been in chapters 4 through 8 for some time now, what you see is that Jesus has been primarily about the business of teaching people. From the very beginning of his ministry, right from the jump, Jesus has been, more than anything else, a teacher. Luke has referred to it over and over and over. Here's just a couple of samples. In Luke chapter 4, as Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and a report about him went out through all the surrounding country. And what did he do in response to this report? He taught in their synagogues. A little bit later in chapter 4, he went down to Capernaum, and he was what? Teaching them on the Sabbath. But he wasn't just teaching them, he was teaching them with authority, right? And they were astonished at his teaching, because his word possessed authority. And then 3 more times in chapters 5 and 6, it refers to his teaching. And then we have, in chapter 6, you remember this maybe, a long extended sample of the kinds of sermons Jesus would teach. And in that sermon, we learn about all kinds of things Jesus is trying to prepare them for ahead of time. Then you come to chapter 8, and there's more examples of his teaching with these parables that we already talked about. Friends, Jesus has been bringing the content to these people. He's been passing along teaching that not only satisfies their intellect, but moves their hearts and prompts them to take action. He had told them, if you remember, about God's kingdom. He had told them what it'll be like. He had told them what their responsibilities were inside that kingdom. He told them how to handle your enemies, how to handle adversity, how to handle conflict and opposition. Jesus had made sure that they had heard many truths that they needed to know if they were going to be ready for the test he had for them. But then he went beyond simply teaching them and giving them teaching. They had also received insightful explanations. You're in chapter 8, right? Do you remember in chapter 8? Look at verse 9, please. In chapter 8, verse 9, we've already had a parable that you could, if you looked at it sideways, you could kind of scratch your head and be like, huh? Like, what's this all about? And then notice verse 9. It says, and when his disciples asked him what the parable meant, he said, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of God, but for others they're in parables, so that seeing they may not see, and hearing they may not understand. And then he says in verse 11, now the parable is this, and then he explains it. So Jesus didn't just give them this deep-sounding teaching, he had also made sure to explain the teaching in depth to his disciples. The disciples got extra tutoring on the side. They had been given the secret decoder rings to understand what Jesus was teaching. If you don't know what those are, just talk to an old person next to you. Jesus wanted to make sure they didn't miss the message because of the way it was packaged. The disciples got to ask questions. They got to hear answers to their questions. They had beautifully, wonderful, extra access to the teacher. And he wasn't stingy with his time. He wasn't stingy with his willingness to explain the ideas that he was teaching if they didn't understand it. So yeah, he's prepared them pretty well with all kinds of insightful explanations. But here's the most important part. They had also observed Jesus's power, hadn't they? When the disciples set out on their 3-hour tour across the Lake of Galilee, and the storm suddenly swept over them, right? They needed at that moment a miracle. They needed supernatural power to protect them from this windstorm. But you know what? It's not like they had never seen a miracle before, right? Let's just briefly recap what they had already seen in the weeks or months leading up to this since they started following Jesus. Well, how about this verse? When the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on how many of them? Just the ones who had enough faith? Just the ones who tithed enough? No. Every single one of them, and he healed them. Okay, then in chapter 5, you have the leper who gets healed. You have a paralytic who gets healed. Remember, comes down from the roof. There's a man with a withered hand in chapter 6. There's the servant of the Gentile centurion in chapter 7. Jesus doesn't even have to lay his hands on that dude. He just says, hey, be healed from a distance, and it's done. Okay, they've seen Jesus with power over disease. Jesus just commands. The disease has to leave. The disease has to obey. The disciples had seen this probably dozens of times. Here's how Luke summarized it in chapter 6. He came down with them, stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him, that's the teaching, and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured, and all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him and healed them all. Friends, these disciples had not been denied access to Jesus' power. They'd seen it in action already. And he mentioned right here about the demons, the power over the demonic world as well. Look at chapter 4, verse 41. Demons also came out of many, crying, "You are the Son of God." But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak because they knew he was the Christ. Friends, this is not a parlor trick. This isn't David Blaine, an illusionist. Ooh, let me try to scare you. This is genuine power over real evil spiritual forces in the world. And these spiritual forces have great power to devastate and destroy. But Jesus commands, and what do? They have to shut up. Why? Simply because he commanded it. Friends, that's power. And they'd seen it probably dozens of times over the last few months. But then, do you remember the story about the fish? Jesus recruits Simon. He wants him to be his follower. Goes out in the boat. Peter didn't catch fish all night. He's a fisherman. And Jesus is like, hey, why don't you put them on the other side? They're like, okay, Jesus, you don't know anything about fishing, but whatever. I'll do it because you asked me to. And he does. And then this happens. He and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken, and so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. The fish filled up the boat, starts to sink the boat again. They've already been in a sinking boat with Jesus because all the fish he had them. He can command the fish in the water, and the fish in the water basically jump into the boat. Fishermen in the room? That'd be nice, right? Although part of the fun is trying to lure them, I get it, but the catching is fun too. Standing up with your picture for Facebook, that's fun too, right? Having the stories about how big it was, that's part of the fun too. And they had seen his power over creation. But friends, I haven't even mentioned the pièce de résistance, the greatest demonstration of Jesus' power. Do you remember when he crashed a funeral? He crashed a funeral. There's a guy laying in the casket. And Jesus commands him to live. He lives, and then he gives him back to the guy's mom. These disciples have not been denied access to the power of Jesus over diseases, over demons, over the fish in the sea, and over death itself. Friends, they are more than prepared for this test. They've been given access to all the knowledge they need. They've heard a lot and they've seen a lot. But here's the question we're going to find out. Have they learned a lot? See, they had knowledge about Jesus, and they had the correct knowledge that they needed in order to pass the test, in order to battle their fear, in order to entrust themselves to their powerful master. But in the boat, guess what? They just don't. In fact, they fail pretty spectacularly. Let's go back to verse 22, because Jesus said, let's go over to the other side. So they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep, and a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water, and they were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. The disciples failed this test of faith because the danger revealed their fear. Now, Luke makes it very clear here, guys, that the disciples, and Jesus too, actually, were in real danger. The winds, there's all kinds of accounts from this era of history of fishermen encountering these windstorms on the Sea of Galilee and having it be devastating and taking of lives. Okay? Waves, when they sweep over the edge of a boat, you can probably bear witness, they can swamp a boat. You can fall into the water. In wild waves, you can get disoriented. You can drown. You can die in one of these things. It's not like Jesus turns to the disciples and like, what are you worried about, dude? It's like, no big deal. No, he knew it was a big deal. It was dangerous. But here's the thing. Their danger provokes a fear that causes the disciples to forget things. Fear always makes you forget. They forgot that there was somebody in the boat who had an answer to this problem. Boy, fear is a powerful force, isn't it? On the one hand, fear is a gift. Because if we didn't have fear, we wouldn't take normal steps to protect ourselves from avoidable danger, and we'd get ourselves hurt a lot more than we ever needed to be hurt. So fear is a gift from God to us. But in a cursed world, in a sinful world, fear is also a curse. Because fear can overwhelm your rational thinking, and it can cause you to begin to fight or to take flight when it's not necessary and when it's not helpful. When I am in the grip of fear, I tend to zone in on the one thing I'm afraid of, and I forgot everything outside of that one thing because it seems secondary to my immediate survival. And when I'm in fear mode, you know what I do? I lean into my natural instincts a lot, don't I? Which, if you haven't bothered over the course of your life to train your instincts, those instincts can lead you into incredibly self-destructive behavior. So these guys, they shake Jesus. They're in an absolute panic, and they proclaim their greatest fears to him. We're gonna die. It's funny, Luke doesn't record them asking Jesus for help. Did you notice that? They just shake him to notify Jesus that it's all over. We're dying. I'm sorry, I know God sent you to the world with this crazy plan to rescue the world from sin, to bring God's kingdom to earth, but I'm sorry, all that's been canceled. There will be no kingdom, there will be no salvation, because we are going down in this unexpected windstorm today. It hit at the wrong place in the wrong time, Master. Really sorry. Hope you weren't planning to save the world, because you're going to die today. See, they had zoomed in on this one danger, and they'd forgotten everything else. They had forgotten everything they had heard and seen in chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And all they can see in their immediate vision is their impending death. And then fear revealed underlying unbelief. See, here's the thing about fear. When fear taps into your quote-unquote natural instincts, it taps into mostly what the Bible calls your flesh. And your flesh is your natural way of seeing God in a fallen condition. It's a natural way of seeing yourself, seeing the world around you. And friends, I've got news for you about your flesh. Your flesh does not trust God at all. Your flesh blames God. Your flesh assumes the worst about God. Your flesh deliberately sets itself in rebellion against God. And so what the disciples' fear had led them to do was to express their underlying distrust of Jesus himself. The disciples' fear led them to express that out loud. What does Jesus say as soon as he calms the storm? He asks them a question, right? Where is your faith? I don't think Jesus is upset that they were afraid. I think he's upset that their fear had led them straight into unbelief. That when you turned up the pressure, when danger appeared, when the waves start swamping the boat a little bit, his students had jumped so quickly to certainty, like certainty, we are going to die. And it's almost like Jesus saying, wait a minute. Do you really think I was going to let you die here in this boat on this lake today? Do you really think that I was going to allow my mission from God to be defeated by bad weather? Why did you think you were going to die? And really what it comes down to is you thought you were going to die because you don't trust me. Now, the disciples either didn't think Jesus was able to save them from the storm, or maybe they thought he was able, but they just didn't think he cared enough to save them from the storm. But either way, they don't trust him. Not when they're facing danger, not when they're under pressure. See, this test exposed in the most embarrassing way, once the storm is calm again, that these students, these disciples, these interns, they had not learned very much at all from all the training and teaching they'd been receiving for 4, 5, 6, 7, 5 chapters now. Yeah, they had intellectually understood the words Jesus said and they nodded their heads. But the moment that their life was actually in danger and they had to apply that teaching to the situation, they decided, you know what, I'm just going to give in to fear, and they rushed towards unbelief. They freaked out. They became convinced it was all over and they were going to die. But here's the part that really bothers me. This unbelief, this lack of trust in Jesus, also revealed a deeper ignorance. Did you notice how this paragraph ends in verse 25? This really bugs me. Verse 25 says, he said to them, where is your faith? And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, who then is this, that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him? What? Wait, what? Who then is this? How can they possibly be asking that question now? I mean, after all that they've seen and heard up until this point, and not just in the boat, but all the things they had learned in the months leading up to this, as they watch him and they listen to him, and supposedly as they're learning from him, now in chapter 8, they're finally saying, bro, this guy might be special. Did it take this to get through to them? I think there's something strange about this guy. How had they not figured that out as they watched the scores of healings, of exorcisms, the miraculous catch of fish, the raising from the dead? Didn't they learn their lesson? You know what the answer is? No. No, they hadn't. That's also what this test revealed. After all that they had seen and heard, they still just plain and simple don't know Jesus very well. They're still ignorant of his true identity. They're spiritual dullards. They're blockheads. And they're spending all this time with someone who they don't really know that well. They've missed all the lessons they needed to learn in chapters 4 through 8. There they were. Yes, the sounds had hit their eardrums and the images had hit their optical nerves, but they weren't really listening, they didn't really hear, and they didn't really see what Jesus had meant for them to see. And here's the key point that I think is so important here. None of those disciples in the boat would have realized that this was the case if Jesus hadn't allowed the test. Failing this test so badly is, or at least could be, a wake-up call the disciples needed. Because Jesus, the teacher, is resorting to one of the sneakiest tricks in his bag. which is to expose his students' naivete and ignorance and unbelief by confronting them with the reality that even though they claimed the title of follower of Jesus, student of Jesus, disciple of Jesus, they actually weren't doing very well. They still had a long, long ways to go. Now, I don't know how that hits you. I don't like this message at all. Because I like to think I'm doing a pretty good job of following Jesus. I mean, I've attended church faithfully for decades. I read the Bible, I hear the sermons, I sing the songs, I even get up early and come to Sunday school. Thank you, I appreciate that. I mean, I drop money in the offering sometimes. I face resistance of some kind. I mean, I volunteer in the 2s and 3s, for goodness sake. I've got the I Love Jesus bumper sticker on the back of my car. I'm doing well. But then what happens? A storm comes along. Something disrupts your little pleasure cruise through life. Somebody slights me. Somebody criticizes me. I get sick. I lose some money. I face resistance of some kind. And immediately, what do? I start to panic. I gossip. I self-medicate with substances. I blow up in rage. I step away from church for a while. I get sullen and grumpy and needy and moody. Yeah, I know Jesus is in my boat. I know how I'm supposed to respond, but Jesus is asleep. He's asleep at the wheel. Jesus isn't fixing my problem, so he must lack power to fix it, or maybe he lacks the compassion to care enough to fix it. Either way, he's weak or a jerk. Maybe this Jesus guy isn't who I thought he was all along. All I know is, you know what? I'm gonna die if I don't fix this, and he's not helping me. And bottom line, I don't trust him. So my unbelief and my ignorance get exposed. And then you know what happens? I don't actually die. Things get resolved in a way that I don't see coming. I make it through the storm, and then my Savior looks me in the eye and he asks me this penetrating question. Hey, Toby, where's your faith? Toby, why don't you trust me yet? After all we've been through together, why don't you know me yet well enough to trust me in the difficult times? And I hit this realization. As a student of Jesus in that moment, I get an F, man. I get an F on that test. And I hate that feeling. Now, this is the part where the people that are only following Jesus for show or to impress people, they usually just sort of fade to black and disappear in this moment of failure. But those of us who really do want to follow Jesus, now we're in a tough quandary. Because leaving isn't really an option, because where else are we going to go? Who else has the words of eternal life? Nobody does. We know he's the answer. We're just doing a lousy job of living it out. So what do I do in this mess? How do I bounce back from this failure? What should I do with this obvious failure? What do I do with my unbelief? What do I do with my ignorance? So before I send you out of here just feeling depressed about what a terrible student, follower of Jesus you are, I just have a couple of suggestions I want to make to you that I think are implicit here. Luke is sort of hinting at them, and I'm going to try to bring them to the surface, and you can agree or disagree, and we can talk about it later. Here's the first thing I think you really need to do. When you find yourself in that moment where you're like, I totally blew the test, I got an F, man. There's no explaining it away. Number one, please, 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 please accept your failure. Please own it. Don't excuse it. In cultures like ours that have been granted rights, and you can say yes by God and creation, blah, 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 but our government actually acknowledges these rights we were given by God. There's a lot of governments around the world that don't acknowledge those rights. And they got to learn how to live under those cultures. We live in a culture where our government, generally speaking, allows us and accepts the fact that we have rights. But along with that, there comes this double-edged sword. And the double-edged sword is that it's always somebody else's fault when something goes wrong. It's always somebody else's fault. Somebody should have, and they didn't, and so now I am responding this way, but what else could I do? And so Jesus comes to us with a message that is pretty countercultural. He says, no, when you mess up, you need to accept that. You need to own it. Listen to this verse. You've maybe heard it before, but I want you to listen to it through different ears. John says to us in 1 John 1:9 on the screen behind me, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That's an incredible verse that should comfort and encourage and strengthen you every single day of your life, because you probably need this verse every single day of your life. But the part I want to call attention to is the first phrase. What's the first word? If we confess. You see, people kind of want to do that thing where it's like, I'm sorry if you were hurt. That's not a confession. I'm sorry if you thought I did something wrong. That is not a confession. I did X and Y and it was wrong. That's a confession. And when we come to God with that approach, then yes, he washes his love and his forgiveness and his grace upon us. And we're forgiven and we're cleansed and it's great and we can start over. But if you don't confess, if you don't say the same thing God said, if you don't say it out loud, you're not going to get what you want. You're not going to be able to get a new start. So I recommend to you, the next time you fail a test of your faith, say something out loud to God like this. You know what, God? I think I'm realizing I just don't trust you very much. You know what, God? I've been in church my whole life, but you know what? After all these years, I still don't seem to know you very well. God, every time I'm in a dangerous situation or a stressful situation, I allow that stress to push me into the arms of fear and panic, and I lose my mind. You say something like, you know what? I'm not really that far along in this whole following Jesus thing, am I? Now, for people that legitimately just started following Jesus a few minutes ago, this is actually fairly easy because they really don't know what else to do. I just started this. I'm just learning this. But for those of us that have been around the block a few times, harder, isn't it? Because you've got the pelts on the wall, man. You got the notches in your belt. You've got the victories you could talk about. You got the failures too. And those failures should teach you an important lesson. So stop posing. Stop putting a brave face on it. Admitting the truth, my friends, it seems scary, but it's really, really very freeing. When you finally just say it. You just say it out loud. You just own it. You admit it. And it's a wonderful place from a spiritual perspective, a wonderful place to start. Here's the second thing. Explore your failure. Explore it. You know what? When we do fail, and this is particularly true in the United States, we don't like the idea of failure. We don't like to go back into our failure and try to understand why it happened. We just want to forget that it happened and put it in the rear view and keep going forward, and hopefully this time I'll succeed without actually having done any work to figure out why you failed in the first place. You know, why did that particular danger trigger you so badly? What is it about your faith in Jesus, your beliefs about Jesus? What specifically was it that you're still struggling to believe? Do you believe God is weak? Now, you would never say that out loud in church, but do you really think that in your heart? He's not able. Or do you maybe think the other thing? He just doesn't care. Why did your unbelief push you to self-medicate? Why did your unbelief push you to lose your temper, to gossip? Why? Friends, you need to become an expert on the inner workings of your own heart and mind. Now, Jesus makes a big deal of the fact you don't need to become an expert on the inner workings of everybody else's hearts and minds. How much energy do you spend doing that, my friend? Oh, I wonder why they did that, and I wonder what they're thinking, and I wonder what they feel about me, and obviously this means this, and this means that, and this means... You put yourself into this mind-blowing freak out stress mode trying to understand the inner workings of other people's minds, and you don't spend any time trying to understand your own. How is this possible? How is this possible? If you want to follow Jesus, you're going to fail along the way. And that can be an opportunity for exploration. And sometimes you can just do this, you and God, and honesty and maybe a piece of paper. Maybe you need a friend to talk it through with you. And you have to give that person permission to tell you the truth. Don't just go to your friends when you need somebody to massage your shoulders. Of course we go to them when we need support. But every now and then you need a friend who's going to talk to you for real. It's not going to tolerate all the stuff and just say, well, you did the man you can. Sometimes it's helpful to get somebody who's been professionally trained in this process. Can we just leave that little bit of shame out the window, please? It's okay. If you can't seem to figure it out and you can't figure out who to talk to go to somebody who's had some training on that. Is that okay? Can we just admit that? Is it okay to call a plumber when your house plumbing doesn't work? Yeah, I don't feel shame. Well, I do feel shame, but that's another story for another day. Talk to whoever you need to talk to about this. Figure it out. You need to know what makes you tick. You need to know why certain things hit you the way that they do. Jesus has allowed you to fail, not because he wants to destroy you and get rid of you, but because he wants to teach you something about yourself. So how well are you learning yourself? One last thing. Expect another test. Now, I know we haven't gone on, and most of you guys, I'm sure, have not read what happens in verse 26 because you're very diligent and you want to just stay focused on this passage. You don't ever let your mind wander. You don't look ahead. I wonder what next week's sermon is going to be. Should I cut up for that one or should I go to the lake? You probably have never done that, so you don't even know what happens next. But let me tell you what happens next. Verse 26. Then they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. When Jesus had stepped out on land, there met him a man from the city who had demons. Oh, great. And then there's a long story about him interacting with this demon-possessed guy. Do you know what Jesus didn't do next? Take them to a deserted part of the Lake of Galilee and say, could you losers get out of the stinking boat, please? I need to go find some people who listen to me. I need to go find people who know how to hear what I'm saying and see what I'm doing. He just went on to the next thing. He finished the boat ride. He got out, and guess what's waiting for them on the shore? A new test. Because this dude, we're going to find out next week, is danger personified in a human form. This guy is dangerous. Getting out of the boat, you're immediately in physical danger from this guy who is there to meet Jesus. So there's another test coming. Here's the thing I want to leave you with, guys. Jesus doesn't abandon his disciples who fail. He keeps working with them. You know what he does sometimes? He sighs, okay? Get over it. He gets frustrated sometimes. We're going to see it in the text. But then you know what he does? He does what every good teacher does. He takes a deep breath and then he starts again. Friends, failure isn't final until your teacher quits. And I've got news for you. Jesus doesn't quit. He's got 16, count them, we're going to be here a long time, 16 more chapters of teaching to do. And he's going to use every last one, every last tool in his toolbox that he needs to use to make sure it gets through to these guys. He's going to drag them across the finish line if it's the last thing he does. Yes, he rebukes them, fine, but he doesn't quit on them. So friends, don't you quit either. The worst thing you could do in failure is think, this is the reason I should walk away. Don't use your failure as an excuse to stop learning, to stop trying, because the training isn't over until the teacher says it is and stops teaching. And friends, I got news about this. Jesus loves teaching. He will stick with you. Yes, he'll test you, and you'll get mad. Why, you didn't tell me this was coming? He'll allow you to fail. And you'll be like, oh, come on, Jesus, I want to have the impression that I always do everything right. But he's never going to quit on you. So friends, when you find yourself reeling on the ground, bloodied up, dusty, whatever it is, get up, take a deep breath, dust yourself off, own your failure, learn from your failure, but then start preparing for the next test. Because I got news for you. Your teacher is not done with you. He's just getting started. Let's pray. God, thank you for this opportunity to study your word, to look at it, to understand it, to grow from it. Lord, this has been really humbling for me this week. I've had to acknowledge to you many times about ways that pressure and danger and stress cause me to abandon everything that I've learned and just go back to the old flesh way of handling things. And that is unbelief and ignorance. And God, I pray that this week, as I face more storms, I face more trials, that I would be faithful, full of faith, and figure out how to at least respond better than I did last time. And I pray for my brothers and sisters. I know the tone of this message has been a little bit harsh, but Lord, in the end, the truth is that none of us have an excuse to quit. None of us. You never want us to quit. You want us to chase after you. You want us to grow. So I pray you would help us to do that. And I ask these things in Jesus' name.